Hi guys! Imagine waking up one morning and the sun simply doesn't rise the way it should. The sky remains dim, shrouded in an eerie twilight that persists throughout the day. Crops begin to fail, temperatures plummet, and a mysterious plague starts spreading across continents. This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel or a Hollywood disaster movie. This was the reality for millions of people living in the year 536 CE, widely considered by historians and scientists to be the absolute worst year to be alive in human history. What makes 536 CE so uniquely terrible isn't just one catastrophic event, but rather a perfect storm of disasters that struck simultaneously across the globe. A massive volcanic eruption, likely in Indonesia, launched so much ash and debris into the atmosphere that it blocked sunlight across the northern hemisphere for over a year. This volcanic winter triggered the coldest decade in over 2,000 years, leading to widespread crop failures and famine. As if that wasn't devastating enough, this same period saw the beginning of the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, known as the Justinian Plague, which would go on to claim millions of lives across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The year 536 CE represents a fascinating and terrifying case study in how natural disasters can cascade into human catastrophes on a global scale. Unlike many historical disasters that affected specific regions or civilizations, the events of 536 CE were truly worldwide in their impact. From the Byzantine Empire struggling to maintain control over its vast territories, to Chinese farmers watching their rice paddies freeze, to Germanic tribes facing starvation in the forests of northern Europe, no corner of the inhabited world escaped the effects of this annus horribilis. Tonight, we're going to explore every aspect of this remarkable year, diving deep into the scientific evidence that helps us understand what happened, examining contemporary accounts from people who lived through these events, and investigating how different civilizations across the world coped with what seemed like the end of times. We'll journey from the volcanic peaks of Indonesia to the imperial palaces of Constantinople, from the rice fields of China to the tribal settlements of northern Europe, painting a comprehensive picture of humanity's darkest hour. We'll discover how modern science, through tree ring analysis, ice core samples, and archaeological evidence, has pieced together the complex puzzle of what made 536 CE so catastrophic. We'll hear the voices of chroniclers and survivors who left behind haunting accounts of their experiences, and we'll explore how these disasters fundamentally changed the course of world history, setting the stage for the rise and fall of empires and shaping the medieval world that would follow. This isn't just a story about ancient history. It's a story about human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, about how societies adapt and survive when everything they know is suddenly turned upside down, and about the interconnectedness of our world that has existed for far longer than we might imagine. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The story of 536 CE begins not with human actions, but with the awesome and terrifying power of nature itself. Somewhere in the Indonesian archipelago, most likely in the region of modern-day Java or Sumatra, a massive volcanic eruption occurred that would change the course of world history. This wasn't just any ordinary volcanic eruption. This was a cataclysmic event that ranks among the most powerful volcanic explosions in recorded human history, comparable to the famous eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 or the ancient eruption of Mount Toba. The exact location of this eruption remains a subject of scientific debate and investigation. Some researchers point to evidence suggesting the eruption occurred at Krakatoa, the same volcanic system that would later produce the famous 1883 eruption. Others argue for different volcanic sources, including potential eruptions in Central America or even multiple simultaneous eruptions. What we do know with certainty is that whatever volcanic event occurred was powerful enough to inject massive quantities of ash, sulfur dioxide, and other particles high into the stratosphere, where they would remain suspended for months or even years. Contemporary accounts from across the known world described the immediate and dramatic effects of this volcanic catastrophe. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from Constantinople, described how the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He noted that people could look directly at the sun without hurting their eyes, and that the sun appeared blue in the sky, a phenomenon we now understand results from volcanic particles filtering sunlight. Similar accounts come from sources across the globe. Chinese chroniclers recorded that the sun appeared dim and blue, and that snow fell during summer months in regions where it had never been seen before. Irish annals describe a year without summer, with widespread crop failures and famine. Even as far away as Mesoamerica, there are indications in the archaeological record of significant climate disruption during this period. The volcanic particles suspended in the atmosphere didn't just dim the sun, they fundamentally altered weather patterns across the globe. The particles acted as tiny mirrors, reflecting sunlight back into space before it could warm the Earth's surface. This created what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of global cooling that would persist for several years. The effects were most pronounced in the northern hemisphere, where temperatures dropped by an average of 1.1, 5 to 2, 5 degrees Celsius, a seemingly small change that had enormous consequences for agriculture and human survival. The darkness wasn't just a matter of dimmed sunlight. Contemporary accounts describe an eerie, twilight-like quality to the daylight hours, with many sources noting that the normal cycle of day and night seemed disrupted. This perpetual gloom had profound psychological effects on populations already struggling with the physical hardships of failed crops and unusual weather. Many contemporary sources interpreted the darkened sun as a divine omen, a sign of impending doom or divine displeasure that added religious and spiritual anxiety to the very real practical challenges people were facing. Archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. Tree ring data from around the world shows dramatically reduced growth in 536 CE and the years immediately following, consistent with reduced sunlight and cooler temperatures. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show elevated levels of sulfates and other volcanic particles, providing a precise chronological marker for the timing and scale of the volcanic event. The global nature of these effects is particularly remarkable when we consider the limited communication and travel of the 6th century. People living in China had no way of knowing that people in Europe were experiencing the same strange phenomena, yet the archaeological and historical record shows that the effects were remarkably consistent across vast distances. This global synchronicity provides powerful evidence for the massive scale of the volcanic event that triggered these changes. The dimming of the sun had immediate and severe consequences for agriculture worldwide. Plants depend on sunlight for photosynthesis, the process by which they convert sunlight into energy and produce food. With significantly reduced sunlight, crops failed on a massive scale. Wheat harvests in Europe were devastated, rice crops in Asia failed to mature properly, and even hardy crops like barley and oats struggled to grow in the altered climate conditions. The agricultural crisis was compounded by the unusual weather patterns that accompanied the volcanic winter. Many regions experienced unseasonably cold temperatures, with frost occurring during what should have been the growing season. Some areas saw unusual precipitation patterns, with either too much rain causing flooding and crop rot, or too little rain leading to drought conditions. The unpredictability of these weather patterns made it nearly impossible for farmers to adapt their practices to cope with the changed conditions. Beyond the immediate effects on crop yields, the prolonged darkness had cascading effects on livestock and wild animal populations. Grazing animals struggled to find adequate food as grasslands failed to grow properly in the reduced sunlight. This led to widespread livestock mortality, further reducing food supplies and eliminating important sources of protein, milk, and other animal products that many communities depended upon for survival. The global nature of the agricultural crisis meant that there were few regions that could provide relief to areas experiencing famine. In normal circumstances, a local crop failure might be offset by imports from more successful agricultural regions. But in 536 CE, virtually every agricultural region was experiencing some degree of crop failure, making trade-based solutions largely impossible. This created a truly global food crisis, unlike anything seen before in recorded history. The psychological impact of living under a darkened sky for months on end cannot be underestimated. Humans are deeply connected to natural cycles of light and darkness, and the disruption of normal sunlight patterns would have had profound effects on mood, behavior, and mental health. Many contemporary sources describe widespread despair and anxiety, with people interpreting the darkened sun as a sign that the end of the world was approaching. Religious leaders and communities across different faiths struggled to interpret these unprecedented events within their theological frameworks. Christian chroniclers often described the darkened sun as a divine punishment for human sins, while other religious traditions interpreted the events through their own spiritual lenses. These religious interpretations, while providing some communities with frameworks for understanding their suffering, also contributed to social tensions and conflicts as different groups blamed each other for bringing divine wrath upon the world. The prolonged period of reduced sunlight also had significant effects on human health beyond the obvious impacts of famine and malnutrition. Vitamin D deficiency would have become widespread as people received insufficient sunlight to produce this essential vitamin naturally. This would have led to increased rates of bone diseases, compromised immune systems, and other health problems that made populations even more vulnerable to the diseases that would soon follow. As the months of 536 CE dragged on with continued darkness and cooling temperatures, it became clear to people around the world that they were experiencing something unprecedented in living memory. Oral traditions and written records were searched for any comparable events, but nothing in human experience had prepared civilizations for the scale and duration of the crisis they were facing. This lack of precedent made it extremely difficult for leaders and communities to develop effective responses to the ongoing catastrophe. The volcanic winter that began in 536 CE would ultimately persist for several years, with 536 through 540 CE representing the coldest consecutive years in over 2 millennia. This extended period of cooling created a sustained crisis that went far beyond the immediate shock of the initial darkening. Communities that might have survived a single year of crop failure found themselves facing year after year of reduced harvests and harsh weather conditions. The climate catastrophe that began with the mysterious darkening of 536 CE quickly evolved into a global crisis that fundamentally altered life for millions of people. The volcanic winter created by the massive eruption didn't just cause a single year of difficult weather. It triggered a cascade of climate changes that persisted for nearly a decade, making the 530s and early 540s the coldest period in over 2,000 years of recorded climate history. Temperature records reconstructed from tree rings, ice cores, and other natural archives show that global temperatures dropped dramatically in the years following 536 CE. In many regions of Europe, average temperatures fell by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, which might seem modest, but represented a catastrophic change for agricultural societies dependent on predictable seasonal patterns. These temperature drops were equivalent to shifting entire agricultural zones hundreds of miles toward the equator, making traditional farming practices suddenly impossible across vast regions. The cooling wasn't uniform across the globe, creating a complex pattern of climate disruption that affected different regions in different ways. Northern Europe experienced some of the most severe cooling, with evidence suggesting that some areas experienced temperatures more typical of the Little Ice Age that wouldn't occur for another 800 years. The British Isles saw widespread crop failures, with archaeological evidence indicating abandoned settlements and reduced population levels during this period. Scandinavia was particularly hard hit by the climate catastrophe. Tree ring evidence from Norway and Sweden shows that forest growth essentially stopped for several years, indicating temperatures so low that even hardy northern tree species struggled to survive. This region, already at the northern limits of agricultural viability, saw many farming communities forced to abandon their settlements and migrate southward in search of more hospitable conditions. The Mediterranean region, typically characterized by warm, dry summers and mild winters, experienced dramatically altered weather patterns. Contemporary accounts describe unusually cold winters, with snow falling in regions where it was rarely seen, and cool, wet summers that prevented traditional crops like grapes and olives from ripening properly. The disruption to Mediterranean agriculture was particularly devastating because this region served as a crucial food source for the Byzantine Empire and other major civilizations of the time. In Asia, the climate disruption was equally severe, but manifested in different ways. Chinese historical records describe widespread famines caused by failed rice harvests, with some regions experiencing snow during summer months. The Yellow River region, one of the most important agricultural areas in China, saw repeated crop failures that led to massive internal migrations as people fled from areas experiencing the worst conditions. The monsoon patterns that much of Asia depends on for agriculture were severely disrupted by the global climate changes. The monsoons are driven by temperature differences between land and sea, and the global cooling caused by the volcanic eruption altered these patterns in ways that reduced rainfall in some regions while causing devastating floods in others. This disruption affected not just China, but also the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and other monsoon-dependent regions. Central Asia, already characterized by challenging climate conditions, became virtually uninhabitable for many nomadic peoples during the worst years of the crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that many nomadic groups were forced to abandon traditional seasonal migration routes as grasslands failed to provide adequate forage for their livestock. This displacement of nomadic peoples created pressure on settled agricultural communities as desperate herders sought new territories that could support their animals. The effects on agriculture went far beyond simple crop. The shortened growing seasons caused by cooler temperatures meant that even crops that survived to maturity often failed to fully ripen, producing lower yields. Farmers across the affected regions found that traditional crop varieties that had been cultivated for generations were suddenly unsuitable for the new climate conditions. The cooling also affected the timing of agricultural seasons in ways that disrupted carefully developed farming practices. Spring came later and ended earlier, reducing the window for planting and growing crops. In many regions, the last frost occurred weeks later than usual, while the first frost of winter arrived much earlier, creating a dramatically shortened growing season that made agriculture extremely challenging, even in areas that hadn't been completely devastated. Livestock farming was severely impacted by the climate changes. Grasslands that normally provided rich grazing became sparse and poor in quality, unable to support the same numbers of animals that had previously thrived there. The poor grass quality meant that even animals that found adequate quantities of food often suffered from malnutrition, affecting milk production, reproduction rates, and overall herd health. The climate catastrophe also had less obvious but equally important effects on food preservation and storage. Many traditional methods of food preservation depend on specific temperature and humidity conditions, and the altered climate made food spoilage rates increased in some regions, while other areas experienced conditions too humid for effective grain storage, compounding the effects of reduced harvests. Wild food sources that many communities relied on as supplements to agricultural production were also severely affected. Nut-producing trees had poor harvests, wild berries failed to ripen properly, and the populations of wild game animals declined as their natural food sources became scarce. This elimination of wild food sources removed an important safety net that communities had traditionally used to survive difficult agricultural years. The global nature of the climate crisis meant that trade-based solutions were largely impossible. In normal circumstances, regions experiencing local climate difficulties might import food from areas with better harvests. However, the widespread nature of the cooling meant that very few regions had surplus food production to export, creating a global shortage that couldn't be resolved through traditional trade mechanisms. Coastal regions that had previously benefited from the moderating effects of ocean temperatures found that even the seas couldn't buffer them from the global cooling. Ocean temperatures also dropped, reducing the thermal mass that normally helped stabilize coastal climates. This meant that even traditionally stable coastal agricultural regions experienced unprecedented temperature swings and weather unpredictability. The psychological and social effects of the prolonged climate crisis were as devastating as the physical hardships. Communities that had developed their identities and social structures around specific agricultural practices found themselves facing the complete failure of their traditional ways of life. This created social tensions, conflicts over scarce resources, and massive population movements as people sought regions less affected by the climate catastrophe. The climate changes triggered by the 536 CE eruption would ultimately persist for nearly a decade, with some effects lasting even longer. Tree ring records show that it wasn't until the late 540s that temperature patterns began to return to something approaching normal, and full recovery took even longer in many regions. This extended duration meant that entire generations grew up during a period of climate instability, creating lasting changes in agricultural practices, settlement patterns, and social organization that would influence the development of medieval civilization for centuries to come. As devastating as the volcanic winter and climate catastrophe were, they were merely the opening acts in the tragedy of 536 CE. The environmental stresses created by the cooling climate and failed harvests created conditions that would soon give rise to an even more deadly threat, the beginning of the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague in human history. What came to be known as the Justinian plague would prove to be one of the most devastating disease outbreaks ever recorded, claiming millions of lives across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which primarily affects rodents but can jump to humans through flea bites. Under normal circumstances, plague tends to remain localized to specific rodent populations, but the environmental disruptions of the late 530s created perfect conditions for the disease to spread far beyond its usual boundaries. The climate changes had disrupted ecosystems across Eurasia, forcing rodent populations to migrate in search of food and suitable habitats. Modern research suggests that the plague likely originated in the Central Asian steppes, where it had long existed in wild rodent populations without significantly affecting human communities. However, the climate catastrophe of 536 CE and the following years created environmental pressures that brought infected rodents into closer contact with human settlements. Starving rats and other rodents, driven from their usual habitats by the harsh conditions, began seeking food in human communities, bringing their fleas and the plague bacterium with them. The first recorded appearances of the plague occurred around 541 CE, just a few years after the initial climate catastrophe began. The disease appears to have spread along trade routes carried by infected rats that traveled on merchant ships and in trading caravans. The weakened state of human populations, already suffering from years of malnutrition and climate stress, made them particularly vulnerable to the new disease. The plague first appeared in major port cities around the Mediterranean, with Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean serving as early centers of the outbreak. The port city of Pelusium in Egypt is often cited as one of the first major urban centers to be struck by the plague, though it's likely that the disease had been spreading through rural areas and smaller settlements for some time before it reached major population centers where its effects would be recorded by chroniclers. From Egypt, the plague spread with terrifying speed throughout the Byzantine Empire. Ships carrying infected rats brought the disease to Constantinople, the empire's capital and largest city, where it caused unprecedented mortality. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the plague firsthand in Constantinople, left a detailed account of its devastating effects on the city. He described how the disease killed so many people that normal burial practices broke down completely, with bodies piling up in the streets and authorities struggling to dispose of the dead. Procopius estimated that the plague was killing 10,000 people per day in Constantinople at the height of the outbreak, though modern historians debate whether such precise numbers are reliable. What's clear from all contemporary accounts is that the mortality rate was astronomical, with some estimates suggesting that 25 to 50% of the population of major cities died during the peak years of the plague outbreak. The symptoms of bubonic plague, as described by contemporary sources, were horrifying and unmistakable. Victims typically developed high fevers, severe headaches, and most characteristically, large, painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes could grow to the size of apples and were excruciatingly painful. Many victims also developed dark spots on their skin, giving rise to the name Black Death that would later be applied to plague outbreaks. The disease progressed rapidly, with most victims dying within days of developing symptoms. This rapid progression, combined with the high mortality rate, created panic and social breakdown in affected communities. Unlike diseases that primarily affected the very young or very old, plague struck people of all ages indiscriminately, devastating entire families and communities. The spread of the plague followed the major trade routes of the ancient world, moving west through the Mediterranean to reach North Africa, Italy, and eventually the western parts of Europe. It also spread east from its origins in Central Asia, affecting communities throughout the Middle East and potentially reaching as far as India and China, though records from these eastern regions are less complete. The plague's arrival in different regions was often preceded by reports of unusual animal behavior and mass die-offs of rats and other rodents. These animal deaths were actually a warning sign that plague was present in the local rodent population, but contemporary observers didn't understand the connection between animal deaths and the human plague that would soon follow. In addition to the direct mortality caused by the disease, the plague had devastating secondary effects on society and the economy. With so many people dying, there were severe labor shortages that affected agriculture, crafts, and trade. Entire skill sets and knowledge bases were lost as master craftsmen, scholars, and other skilled individuals died without being able to pass on their expertise to the next generation. The plague also disrupted military operations and political administration throughout the affected regions. The Byzantine Empire, already struggling with the effects of the climate catastrophe, found its military campaigns severely hampered by plague outbreaks that decimated both soldiers and the civilian populations that supported military operations. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague, but was among the fortunate minority who survived the disease. Religious communities were particularly hard hit by the plague, as monks, priests, and other religious figures often placed themselves at greater risk by caring for plague victims. Monasteries that had been centers of learning and preservation of knowledge suffered devastating losses, with entire communities sometimes being wiped out completely. This had long-term effects on education and the preservation of classical knowledge. The psychological impact of the plague was as devastating as its physical effects. People living through the outbreak had no understanding of what caused the disease or how to prevent it. The seemingly random nature of who lived and who died, combined with the rapid spread and high mortality rate, created widespread terror and despair. Many contemporary sources describe communities where survivors were too few and too traumatized to maintain normal social functions. Different communities responded to the plague in various ways. Some turned to increased religious devotion, believing the plague was divine punishment that might be averted through prayer and penance. Others became fatalistic, abandoning normal social conventions in the belief that death was inevitable. Some communities tried to isolate themselves from the outside world, while others fled from affected areas, often unknowingly carrying the disease with them to new regions. The plague outbreak that began in the 540s would continue recurring in waves for the next 2 centuries, establishing bubonic plague as a persistent threat to European and Mediterranean civilizations. While the initial outbreak was the most devastating, subsequent waves continued to cause significant mortality and social disruption well into the 8th century. Modern genetic analysis of plague bacteria found in ancient burial sites has confirmed that the Justinian plague was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for later plague outbreaks, including the famous Black Death of the 14th century. This genetic evidence also suggests that the plague strain involved in the Justinian plague was particularly virulent, possibly explaining why it caused such devastating mortality rates. The combination of climate catastrophe and pandemic created a perfect storm of disasters that would fundamentally reshape the world of late antiquity. Communities that had already been weakened by years of famine and climate stress found themselves facing a deadly disease that showed no mercy to the young or old, rich or poor. The simultaneous occurrence of these disasters created a crisis unlike anything in recorded human history, setting the stage for the social, political, and economic transformations that would define the early medieval period. The disasters that began in 536 CE struck at a particularly challenging time for the Byzantine Empire, which under Emperor Justinian I had been experiencing one of its most ambitious periods of expansion and reconquest. Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565 CE, had dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory by reconquering the western territories that had been lost to Germanic kingdoms during the previous century. The catastrophic events of 536 CE and the following years would turn these ambitious dreams into desperate struggles for survival. When the volcanic winter began in 536 CE, Justinian's forces were actively engaged in military campaigns aimed at reconquering former Roman territories in North Africa and Italy. The Gothic War in Italy, which had begun in 535 CE, was one of Justinian's most important military ventures, intended to reclaim the Italian peninsula from the Ostrogothic kingdom. However, the climate catastrophe and its consequences would transform this war of conquest into a prolonged and devastating conflict that would last for decades. The cooling climate and agricultural failures created immediate logistical problems for Byzantine military operations. Armies depend on reliable food supplies, and the widespread crop failures made it extremely difficult to provision large military forces in the field. Traditional supply lines that had sustained Byzantine armies were disrupted as agricultural regions throughout the empire struggled to feed their own populations, let alone support military campaigns. The city of Constantinople, the empire's capital and largest city, faced unprecedented challenges during this period. As the plague struck the city in 541 CE, normal urban functions broke down completely. The imperial bureaucracy, which had been one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the world, was devastated by disease-related mortality. Key government officials, administrators, and scribes died in massive numbers, leaving gaps in the administrative structure that took years to fill. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague during the outbreak in Constantinople, and for a time it appeared that he might die from the disease. His survival was seen as miraculous by his supporters, but even after his recovery, the emperor faced enormous challenges in maintaining control over his vast empire. The plague had killed so many people that tax revenues plummeted, making it difficult to fund military operations and maintain the expensive bureaucratic apparatus that kept the empire functioning. The military effects of the disasters were equally devastating. Plague outbreaks repeatedly decimated Byzantine armies, forcing commanders to abandon campaigns or fight with severely reduced forces. The Gothic War in Italy, which had begun with high hopes for quick victory, dragged on for years as both sides struggled with the effects of disease and climate catastrophe. Cities that had initially welcomed Byzantine forces as liberators found themselves caught in prolonged sieges and conflicts that devastated urban populations. The general Belisarius, one of Justinian's most capable military commanders, found his campaigns in Italy repeatedly disrupted by plague outbreaks among his forces. What should have been a straightforward reconquest became a grinding war of attrition that consumed enormous resources while achieving limited results. The prolonged nature of these conflicts created additional suffering for civilian populations who found themselves caught between competing armies while also struggling with famine and disease. The Byzantine Empire's financial system came under severe strain during this period. The combination of reduced tax revenues due to population loss and increased military expenditures created a fiscal crisis that forced the government to adopt increasingly desperate measures. Justinian was forced to debase the currency and impose heavy taxes on the surviving population, creating additional hardship for people already struggling with the effects of famine and plague. The empire's diplomatic relationships were also affected by the ongoing disasters. Byzantine diplomacy had traditionally relied on the empire's wealth and military power to maintain alliances and intimidate enemies. However, the obvious weakness created by the disasters emboldened enemies and made allies less reliable. Persian forces took advantage of Byzantine weakness to launch attacks on the empire's eastern borders, forcing Justinian to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The administrative challenges faced by the empire were particularly severe in the provinces farthest from Constantinople. Communication with distant provinces became increasingly difficult as travel became dangerous and administrative personnel died from plague. Some provinces effectively became autonomous as local governors were forced to make decisions without guidance from the imperial capital, while others descended into chaos as administrative structures completely collapsed. The empire's military recruitment system also faced unprecedented challenges. The traditional system of recruiting soldiers from rural populations broke down as agricultural communities were devastated by famine and disease. Many potential recruits were either dead, too weakened by malnutrition to serve effectively, or needed to remain in their communities to help maintain basic agricultural production. Religious administration throughout the empire was severely disrupted by the disasters. The Byzantine Empire was deeply Christian, and the church played a crucial role in education, social services, and maintaining social order. However, plague outbreaks devastated monastic communities and urban churches, killing bishops, priests, and monks in large numbers. This created not only administrative problems, but also spiritual crises, as communities struggled to understand why they were suffering such unprecedented disasters. The empire's urban centers, which had been among the most sophisticated in the world, experienced severe decline during this period. Cities that had boasted populations in the hundreds of thousands saw their populations reduced by half or more due to plague mortality and outmigration. Urban infrastructure began to deteriorate as there were insufficient people and resources to maintain complex systems like aqueducts, sewage systems, and public buildings. Trade, which had been one of the foundations of Byzantine prosperity, was severely disrupted by the combination of disasters. Merchant networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries were broken as trading cities experienced massive population losses, and traditional trade routes became dangerous or unprofitable. This further reduced the empire's tax revenues and made it difficult to obtain essential resources from distant regions. The legal system, which had reached a high point of sophistication under Justinian's famous law code, faced practical challenges as courts struggled to function with reduced personnel and communities grappled with unprecedented social problems. Property disputes became common as entire families died from plague, leaving unclear inheritance situations. Traditional legal procedures broke down in communities where there were insufficient surviving officials to maintain normal judicial functions. Despite these enormous challenges, Justinian and his administration showed remarkable resilience in attempting to maintain imperial unity and functionality. The emperor implemented emergency measures to maintain food supplies, reorganized the military command structure to account for personnel losses, and adapted administrative procedures to function with reduced staffing. However, these efforts could only partially compensate for the scale of the disasters affecting the empire. The long-term effects of the disasters on the Byzantine Empire were profound and lasting. The empire emerged from this period significantly weakened, with reduced territory, smaller populations, and diminished resources. The grand ambitions of reconquering the Western Roman Empire had to be largely abandoned as the empire focused on basic survival and consolidation of its core territories. The political instability created by the disasters also had important consequences for the empire's future development. The weakening of central authority during the crisis years allowed for the development of more autonomous regional power structures that would eventually evolve into the theme system that characterized later Byzantine administration. In many ways, the disasters of 536 CE and the following years marked the transition from the late Roman Empire to the distinctly medieval Byzantine Empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. While the disasters of 536 CE had devastating effects on the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world, their impact was truly global, affecting civilizations across the known world in ways that historians and archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The same volcanic eruption that darkened the skies over Constantinople also brought catastrophic changes to communities in China, Northern Europe, the Americas, and other regions that had no contact with the Mediterranean world. In China, the period corresponding to 536 to 540 CE coincided with the end of the Northern Wei dynasty and the beginning of a period of political fragmentation known as the Northern and Southern Dynasties period. While Chinese historical sources don't always make explicit connections between climate events and political changes, the timing suggests that the global climate catastrophe played a significant role in the political instability that characterized China during these years. Chinese historical records from this period describe unusual weather phenomena that closely parallel the accounts from Mediterranean sources. The history of the northern dynasties describes how the sun was dim and without light, and notes unusual cold weather and failed harvests. These accounts, combined with tree ring data from China, confirm that the climate effects of the 536 CE eruption were felt strongly across East Asia. The agricultural crisis in China was particularly severe because the country's large population was heavily dependent on rice cultivation, which requires specific temperature and growing conditions. The cooling temperatures and reduced sunlight made it impossible for rice crops to mature properly in many regions, leading to widespread famine. Chinese sources describe people eating bark, grass, and other non-food items to survive, and report that many regions experienced significant population decreases during this period. The climate catastrophe in China also disrupted the country's complex system of canals and waterways. Unusual weather patterns led to both droughts and floods in different regions, damaging the infrastructure that Chinese civilization depended on for transportation, irrigation, and flood control. The maintenance of these water control systems required large amounts of coordinated labor, but the population losses and social disruption caused by famine made such large-scale projects increasingly difficult to organize. In Northern Europe, Germanic and Celtic peoples who had no written historical traditions of their own left archaeological evidence of severe disruption during this period. Tree ring data from Scandinavia shows that forest growth virtually stopped in many areas during the late 530s and early 540s, indicating temperatures so low that even hardy northern tree species couldn't grow normally. Archaeological evidence from Britain and Ireland suggests widespread settlement abandonment during this period. Many farming communities that had been established during the relatively warm period of the early 6th century were abandoned as the climate became too harsh to support agriculture. This forced population movements and social disruption that may have contributed to the Anglo-Saxon expansion into Celtic territories during this period. The Scandinavian peoples, who were already living at the northern limits of agricultural viability, faced particularly severe challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities were forced to abandon farming entirely and rely more heavily on hunting, fishing, and raiding to survive. This may have contributed to the beginning of the expansion period that would eventually lead to the Viking Age several centuries later. The archaeological record from Germanic settlements along the Rhine frontier shows clear evidence of disruption during this period. Many settlements that had been thriving during the early 6th century show signs of abandonment or significant population reduction during the 540s. This population pressure may have contributed to increased Germanic migration into former Roman territories as communities sought more hospitable regions where they could survive the climate catastrophe. In the Americas, where no written records exist from this period, the evidence for the global impact of 536 CE comes primarily from tree ring data and archaeological evidence. Tree rings from North and South America show clear evidence of the global cooling event, with growth patterns indicating severely reduced temperatures and altered precipitation patterns across the Western Hemisphere. The Mayan civilization in Mesoamerica appears to have experienced significant disruption during this period, though the connections between climate change and cultural developments are complex and still being studied. Some researchers suggest that the climate catastrophe may have contributed to the political fragmentation and conflict that characterized the late Classic period of Maya civilization. In South America, tree ring data from the Andes shows clear evidence of the global cooling, with some regions experiencing their coldest temperatures in over a millennium. High-altitude agricultural communities that depended on potato cultivation would have been particularly vulnerable to the temperature drops, as potatoes require specific growing conditions that would have been severely disrupted by the climate changes. The Eurasian steppe peoples, who had traditionally played important roles as intermediaries in long-distance trade and as military forces hired by settled civilizations, faced severe challenges as their traditional pastoral lifestyle became increasingly difficult to maintain. The cooling climate reduced the productivity of grasslands that their herds depended on, while the widespread disruption of trade routes eliminated many of their traditional economic opportunities. Archaeological evidence from Central Asia shows that many nomadic peoples were forced to abandon traditional seasonal migration routes as grasslands failed to recover from the harsh winters and cool summers. This displacement created pressure on agricultural communities around the edges of the steppes, as desperate nomadic groups sought new territories that could support their animals and families. The Persian Empire, while less well documented during this period than the Byzantine Empire, also faced significant challenges from the global disasters. Persian territories in Central Asia would have been directly affected by the climate changes, while the empire's western provinces faced many of the same challenges as Byzantine territories. The weakness of both major powers during this period contributed to increased instability along their shared borders. In the Indian subcontinent, the limited historical records from this period suggest that the region experienced significant climate disruption, though the effects may have been somewhat less severe than in higher latitude regions. The disruption of monsoon patterns would have affected agricultural communities across much of the subcontinent, potentially contributing to political and social changes that occurred during the 6th century. The global nature of these effects is particularly remarkable when we consider that people living in different parts of the world had no way of knowing that others were experiencing similar hardships. A farmer in Northern Europe watching his crops fail had no knowledge that a Chinese peasant thousands of miles away was facing the same challenges, yet both were victims of the same global catastrophe. This global synchronicity provides powerful evidence for the massive scale of the volcanic event that triggered the 536 CE crisis. The fact that tree rings from North America, China, Europe, and South America all show the same patterns of disrupted growth during this period demonstrates that the atmospheric effects of the eruption were truly worldwide in scope. The varied responses of different civilizations to these global challenges also provide insight into the resilience and adaptability of human societies. Some communities were able to adapt to the changed conditions and eventually recover, while others experienced permanent decline or collapse. These different outcomes were influenced by factors such as population density, agricultural systems, political organization, and access to alternative resources. The global perspective on 536 CE also highlights the interconnectedness of the ancient world in ways that might not be immediately obvious. While direct communication and trade connections between distant regions were limited, the shared experience of global climate catastrophe created similar pressures and challenges that influenced historical developments across multiple continents. Understanding the global scope of the 536 CE disaster also provides important context for interpreting the historical developments that followed. The weakening of major civilizations like the Byzantine Empire and Chinese dynasties created opportunities for the rise of new powers and the reorganization of political structures across much of the inhabited world. The recovery patterns from the global catastrophe also varied significantly by region, with some areas bouncing back relatively quickly, while others experienced prolonged periods of reduced population and economic activity. These differential recovery patterns would have important implications for the balance of power between different regions in subsequent centuries. Modern climate science has provided crucial insights into how the 536 CE volcanic eruption could have had such widespread and synchronized effects. The injection of massive quantities of sulfur compounds into the stratosphere created a global aerosol layer that persisted for several years, affecting weather patterns and temperatures across the entire planet. The global perspective on 536 CE also serves as a powerful reminder of how vulnerable human civilizations are to natural disasters, even when they occur in distant locations. The volcanic eruption that triggered the crisis probably occurred thousands of miles away from most of the affected populations, yet its effects were felt across the entire inhabited world. For people living through these events in the 6th century, the experience of witnessing their known world seemingly collapse simultaneously across vast distances must have been profoundly terrifying and disorienting. Without modern scientific understanding of global climate systems, there was no framework for understanding how disasters in one part of the world could affect conditions everywhere else. The archaeological and historical evidence for the global impact of 536 CE continues to accumulate as researchers study new sites and apply new analytical techniques to existing evidence. Each new piece of evidence adds to our understanding of how this remarkable year affected human communities across the planet and shaped the course of subsequent history. The global scale of the 536 CE disaster also provides important lessons for understanding how modern civilization might respond to similar large-scale natural catastrophes. While our modern world has advantages such as global communication, international aid systems, and scientific understanding that weren't available to 6th century populations, we also have much larger populations and more complex systems that could be vulnerable to disruption. While the grand narratives of imperial politics and global climate change provide the broad framework for understanding 536 CE, the true human cost of this catastrophic year becomes most vivid when we examine what daily life was like for ordinary people struggling to survive in the midst of unprecedented disasters. The archaeological record, combined with scattered contemporary accounts, provides glimpses into the lived experiences of farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and families who found their familiar world suddenly transformed into a hostile and unpredictable environment. For agricultural communities, which comprised the vast majority of the world's population in the 6th century, the climate catastrophe fundamentally disrupted the seasonal rhythms that had governed human life for millennia. Farmers who had inherited generations of knowledge about when to plant, when to harvest, and how to read weather signs found that their traditional wisdom was suddenly useless in the face of unprecedented conditions. The spring of 537 CE would have been particularly terrifying for farming communities across the Northern Hemisphere. As the planting season arrived, farmers faced skies that remained dimmed by volcanic particles, temperatures that stayed unseasonably cold, and weather patterns that defied all previous experience. Many would have delayed planting, hoping for conditions to improve, only to realize as the weeks passed that the strange weather was not a temporary aberration. Archaeological evidence from farming settlements across Europe shows adaptations that reveal the desperate measures people took to survive. Excavations have uncovered evidence of people attempting to cultivate crops in protected microclimates, such as south-facing slopes or sheltered valleys that might offer slightly warmer conditions. Some communities appear to have attempted to extend growing seasons by using primitive greenhouse techniques, covering plants with animal skins, or constructing windbreaks to create warmer growing conditions. The failure of traditional food storage methods created additional challenges for surviving communities. Many traditional preservation techniques depended on specific temperature and humidity conditions that were disrupted by the altered climate. Grain storage pits that had reliably preserved harvests through normal winters proved inadequate during the prolonged cold periods. This meant that even communities that had managed to produce some food found themselves facing spoilage and waste of their precious reserves. Families that had lived comfortably for generations suddenly found themselves facing starvation. Contemporary accounts describe people eating bark, roots, grass, and other materials that would normally never be considered food. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, with analysis of human remains from this period showing clear signs of severe malnutrition and dietary stress. The search for alternative food sources led to dramatic changes in daily routines and social behaviors. Forest resources that had previously been used only as supplements to agricultural production became crucial for survival. Communities organized systematic foraging expeditions to gather nuts, berries, mushrooms, and other wild foods. However, the climate changes had also affected wild food sources, making even these alternatives scarce and unreliable. Hunting and fishing became increasingly important as traditional agriculture failed, but even these activities were complicated by the environmental changes. Wild animal populations were also stressed by the altered climate and reduced food sources, making them harder to find and hunt successfully. Rivers and lakes experienced changes in temperature and seasonal patterns that affected fish populations and made traditional fishing techniques less effective. The social fabric of communities came under severe strain as traditional systems of mutual aid and cooperation were stretched beyond their limits. Village communities that had traditionally shared resources during difficult times found that everyone was facing crisis simultaneously, making it impossible to help struggling neighbors. This breakdown of community support systems created additional psychological stress for people already dealing with physical hardship. Family structures were particularly affected by the prolonged crisis. With high mortality rates from malnutrition and disease, many families lost key members who had played crucial roles in household production and decision-making. Children were often left orphaned, while adults found themselves caring for relatives and community members who had no other support systems. The daily rhythm of life changed dramatically as people were forced to spend increasing amounts of time and energy simply searching for food. Activities that had previously occupied much of people's time, such as craft production, maintenance of homes and tools, and community gatherings, had to be abandoned in favor of the constant search for survival resources. Women's roles were particularly affected by the crisis, as traditional gender divisions of labor broke down under Women who had previously focused on household production and childcare found themselves engaged in heavy agricultural labor, foraging expeditions, and other activities that had traditionally been men's work. Pregnant women and nursing mothers faced particular challenges as malnutrition affected their ability to carry pregnancies to term and produce adequate breast milk for infants. Children's experiences during this period were especially tragic. Growing up during the crisis years meant experiencing constant hunger, witnessing the deaths of family members and community members, and living in a world where the normal patterns of childhood development were disrupted by survival needs. Many children were forced to take on adult responsibilities at very young ages as families struggled to maintain basic functions. The psychological impact of living through such an extended crisis cannot be underestimated. People who had grown up with certain expectations about the predictability of natural cycles and the reliability of traditional knowledge found themselves in a world where nothing could be taken for granted. This created widespread anxiety, depression, and social tension that complicated efforts to organize effective responses to the crisis. Religious and spiritual practices provided some communities with frameworks for understanding and coping with their suffering, but even these traditional sources of comfort were strained by the unprecedented nature of the disasters. Many communities interpreted the disasters as signs of divine displeasure, leading to increased religious devotion, but also to conflicts over what behaviors might have caused such punishment. The breakdown of normal social hierarchies created both opportunities and additional stresses. In some communities, traditional authority structures collapsed as leaders proved unable to provide effective responses to the crisis. This created opportunities for new leaders to emerge, but also led to conflicts and power struggles at times when cooperation was most essential for survival. Trade and commerce, which had connected communities and provided access to goods and resources from distant regions, largely broke down during the worst years of the crisis. Merchants who had previously traveled established routes found that their traditional suppliers and customers were no longer able to engage in trade. This isolation forced communities to become much more self-sufficient, but also eliminated access to resources that had previously been available through trade networks. Craftspeople and artisans faced particular challenges as demand for their products declined dramatically. When people are struggling to find enough food to survive, there is little market for pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other manufactured goods. Many skilled craftspeople were forced to abandon their trades and join in agricultural or foraging activities, leading to the loss of specialized knowledge and skills that had been developed over generations. The physical appearance of communities changed dramatically during this period. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements contracted significantly as houses were abandoned and populations concentrated into smaller areas that were easier to defend and heat. Public buildings and religious structures that had been maintained by community labor and resources often fell into disrepair as all available energy was redirected towards survival activities. Personal hygiene and healthcare, already challenging in the 6th century, became even more difficult as people lacked the resources to maintain normal standards of cleanliness and nutrition. This created conditions that made populations more vulnerable to the diseases that would soon follow, as weakened immune systems and poor sanitation facilitated the spread of infectious diseases. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the archaeological record also reveals remarkable examples of human resilience and adaptation. Some communities developed innovative solutions to the crisis, such as new agricultural techniques adapted to the changed climate conditions, more efficient methods of food preservation, or new forms of social organization that better supported survival during difficult times. The crisis also revealed the importance of community solidarity and cooperation. Communities that were able to maintain social cohesion and organize collective responses to the challenges were more likely to survive and eventually recover. These experiences of shared hardship created bonds between survivors that would influence community development for generations to come. The daily experience of living through 536 CE and the following disaster years was fundamentally different from anything that previous generations had experienced. People living through these events were essentially pioneers in learning how human communities could survive and adapt to global environmental catastrophe. Their experiences, preserved in archaeological remains and scattered historical accounts, provide valuable insights into human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The story of 536 CE is not just a tale of ancient disasters, but also a remarkable testament to the power of modern science to uncover and understand events from the distant past. The detailed knowledge we now have about this catastrophic year comes from an impressive array of scientific techniques and interdisciplinary research that allows us to piece together a comprehensive picture of events that occurred nearly 15 centuries ago. The foundation of our understanding of 536 CE comes from dendrochronology, the science of analyzing tree rings to reconstruct past climate conditions. Trees add a new ring of growth each year, and the width and characteristics of these rings reflect the environmental conditions during each growing season. When scientists began systematically analyzing tree rings from around the world in the mid-20th century, they discovered that trees from widely separated regions all showed the same pattern of severely reduced growth during the late 530s and early 540s CE. The tree ring evidence is particularly compelling because it comes from multiple continents and different tree species, yet shows remarkably consistent patterns. Ancient oak trees in Ireland, pine trees from Scandinavia, and bristlecone pines from North America all recorded the same years of stress and reduced growth. This global synchronicity provided the first strong evidence that 536 CE marked the beginning of a worldwide climate catastrophe rather than regional weather anomalies. Ice core analysis has provided another crucial line of evidence for understanding the 536 CE disaster. When snow falls on the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, it traps atmospheric particles and gases that provide a record of past atmospheric conditions. Scientists can drill deep into these ice sheets to extract cores that preserve year-by-year records of atmospheric composition stretching back thousands of years. The ice core records show clear spikes in sulfate concentrations during the 530s and 540s CE, indicating that large quantities of volcanic sulfur compounds were present in the atmosphere during this period. These sulfate spikes correspond precisely with the tree ring evidence for climate disruption, providing independent confirmation that a major volcanic eruption occurred around this time. The ice core data also provides insights into the scale and duration of the volcanic impact. The persistence of elevated sulfate levels for several years indicates that the eruption was massive enough to inject particles high into the stratosphere, where they could circulate globally and persist for extended periods. This explains how a single volcanic eruption could have worldwide effects lasting for several years. Archaeological evidence has provided crucial insights into how human communities responded to the crisis. Excavations at sites across Europe, Asia, and other regions have revealed patterns of settlement abandonment, changes in burial practices, evidence of malnutrition in skeletal remains, and alterations in material culture that all point to severe social disruption during the 540s CE. Particularly compelling evidence comes from urban excavations that show clear changes in city life during this period. Layers of archaeological deposits from major cities like Constantinople show evidence of rapid population decline, changes in waste disposal patterns, and alterations in the types of goods being imported and produced. These archaeological signatures provide concrete evidence for the urban crisis described in historical sources. Modern climate modeling has helped scientists understand how a volcanic eruption could have had such widespread and long-lasting effects. Computer models that simulate global atmospheric circulation can show how volcanic particles injected into the stratosphere would have spread around the world and affected temperature and precipitation patterns in different regions. These climate models have been crucial for understanding why the effects of the 536 CE eruption were so much more severe than many other volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The timing, location, and scale of the eruption created optimal conditions for maximum climate impact, with particles persisting in the atmosphere longer than usual and affecting global weather patterns more severely than smaller or differently timed eruptions. Genetic analysis of ancient plague bacteria has provided remarkable insights into the Justinian plague that followed the climate catastrophe. Scientists have been able to extract DNA from plague bacteria preserved in ancient burial sites, allowing them to study the genetic characteristics of the plague strain that caused the 6th century pandemic. This genetic analysis has confirmed that the Justinian plague was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for later plague outbreaks. The genetic studies have also provided insights into the origins and evolution of the plague bacterium, helping scientists understand how this deadly disease emerged and spread during the 6th century crisis. Paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, has placed the 536 CE event in the context of longer-term climate history. By analyzing climate proxy data from multiple sources, scientists have been able to show that the 530s and 40s CE represented the coldest period in over 2 millennia, making it clear that this was an exceptional event rather than normal climate variability. Historical linguistics has also contributed to our understanding of this period by analyzing how languages changed in response to population movements and social disruption during the crisis years. Changes in vocabulary, place names, and linguistic boundaries can provide evidence for population movements and cultural changes that occurred during periods of social stress. Volcanic geology and geochemistry have helped scientists identify potential sources for the massive eruption that triggered the 536 CE crisis. By analyzing volcanic deposits and comparing their chemical signatures with atmospheric evidence from ice cores, researchers have narrowed down the possible locations and characteristics of the eruption responsible for the global catastrophe. Modern epidemiological studies have provided insights into how plague spreads and persists in different environmental conditions, helping historians understand how the climate changes of the 530s could have created conditions favorable for the emergence and spread of the Justinian plague. Understanding modern plague ecology has been crucial for interpreting ancient accounts of plague outbreaks. Isotope analysis of ancient human and animal remains has provided detailed information about diet, migration patterns, and environmental conditions during the crisis period. Different isotopes in bone and tooth enamel can reveal what people ate, where they lived, and how their diets changed in response to environmental stress. Sediment analysis from lake beds and ocean floors has provided additional evidence for the global environmental changes that occurred during the 536 CE period. These natural archives preserve records of changing vegetation, erosion patterns, and atmospheric deposition that complement the evidence from tree rings and ice cores. The integration of all these different types of evidence has created a remarkably detailed and comprehensive understanding of the 536 CE disaster that would have been impossible using any single research method. This interdisciplinary approach demonstrates the power of modern science to illuminate even distant historical events when multiple lines of evidence are brought together systematically. The scientific study of 536 CE also provides important insights for understanding how similar events might affect the modern world. Climate models developed to study ancient volcanic impacts can also be used to predict the effects of future volcanic eruptions, helping modern societies prepare for potential climate disasters. The research techniques developed for studying 536 CE have also been applied to understanding other historical climate disasters, creating a growing body of knowledge about how natural catastrophes have shaped human history. This research has revealed that climate disasters have played much larger roles in historical developments than was previously recognized. The continuing development of new analytical techniques means that our understanding of 536 CE continues to evolve and become more detailed. New methods for analyzing ancient DNA, more sophisticated climate models, and improved techniques for dating and analyzing archaeological materials all contribute to an increasingly complete picture of this remarkable year. The scientific investigation of 536 CE also demonstrates the importance of preserving environmental archives like ice cores, tree rings, and sediment deposits that contain records of past environmental conditions. These natural libraries provide irreplaceable information. The remarkable scientific reconstruction of the 536C disaster shows how modern interdisciplinary research can bring ancient events to life with unprecedented detail and accuracy. Through the combined efforts of climatologists, archaeologists, historians, geneticists, and other specialists, we can now understand not just what happened during this catastrophic year, but also how and why it happened and what it meant for the people who lived through it. The catastrophic events that began in 536 CE didn't just cause immediate suffering and death. They fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history in ways that continued to influence human civilization for centuries to come. The combination of climate catastrophe, pandemic disease, and social collapse created a watershed moment that marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of what we now recognize as the medieval period. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the 536 CE disaster was the permanent weakening of the classical Mediterranean world that had dominated European and Near Eastern civilization for over a millennium. The Roman Empire had already been divided and transformed during the 4th and 5th centuries, but the events of the 530s and 540s dealt a final blow to any hopes of restoration or reunification of the classical Roman world. The Byzantine Empire, which had represented the most successful continuation of Roman imperial traditions, emerged from the crisis period significantly weakened and permanently altered. The grand ambitions of Emperor Justinian to reconquer the Western Mediterranean and restore Roman imperial unity had to be largely abandoned. The empire that survived the crisis was smaller, poorer, and more focused on defensive rather than expansionist strategies. This fundamental shift in Byzantine capabilities and ambitions had profound implications for the development of medieval Europe. Without a strong Byzantine presence in Italy and the Western Mediterranean, local powers and emerging kingdoms had more freedom to develop independently. This contributed to the political fragmentation that would characterize medieval Europe with its complex mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states rather than unified imperial control. The plague pandemic that began during the crisis years established bubonic plague as a persistent threat to European and Mediterranean populations for the next 2 centuries. The recurring waves of plague that followed the initial outbreak continued to cause significant mortality and social disruption, preventing full demographic and economic recovery and contributing to the long-term transformation of European society. The demographic impact of the combined disasters was enormous and long-lasting. Population levels in many regions didn't return to pre-536 CE levels for several centuries, fundamentally altering the relationship between population and available land. This demographic decline contributed to the ruralization of European society, as urban populations declined dramatically and agricultural settlements became more scattered and self-sufficient. The economic systems that had connected the Mediterranean world were permanently disrupted by the crisis. Trade networks that had flourished for centuries were broken, and many never fully recovered. This contributed to the localization of economic activity that characterized the early medieval period, with communities becoming more self-sufficient and long-distance trade becoming much more limited and irregular. The agricultural systems of Europe were fundamentally transformed by the need to adapt to the changed climate conditions and reduced populations. The crisis forced communities to develop new farming techniques and crop varieties better suited to cooler, more unpredictable weather patterns. These agricultural innovations would influence European farming practices for centuries to come. The political structures that emerged from the crisis were notably different from those that had existed before 536 CE. The centralized imperial systems that had characterized the late Roman period gave way to more localized power structures based on personal relationships and military service rather than bureaucratic administration. This transformation laid the groundwork for the feudal systems that would dominate medieval European politics. In the Byzantine Empire, the crisis contributed to the development of the theme system, a military administrative organization that granted land to soldier farmers in exchange for military service. This system, which became central to Byzantine organization for centuries, represented a fundamental departure from earlier Roman administrative practices and reflected the need to maintain military capabilities with reduced population and resources. The religious and cultural consequences of the crisis were equally significant. The apparent failure of traditional gods and religious practices to prevent or ameliorate the disasters led to significant religious changes across many regions. In some areas, this contributed to the spread of Christianity, while in others it led to the development of new religious syncretisms or the revival of older spiritual traditions. The crisis also had important implications for the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge and culture. The deaths of many educated individuals and the destruction of libraries and schools during the plague outbreaks led to significant losses of classical learning. While some knowledge was preserved in monasteries and other religious institutions, much was lost permanently, contributing to the intellectual decline that characterized the early medieval period. The experience of living through such unprecedented disasters also influenced medieval worldviews and cultural attitudes. The memory of the crisis years contributed to a more pessimistic and apocalyptic outlook that characterized much of early medieval thought. The knowledge that civilization could collapse so quickly and completely influenced medieval concepts of the fragility of human achievements and the unpredictability of divine judgment. In China, the crisis contributed to the political fragmentation that characterized the late 6th and early 7th centuries, delaying the reunification that would eventually occur under the Sui and Tang dynasties. The demographic and economic impacts of the climate disaster influenced the development of Chinese agricultural and administrative practices for centuries to come. The crisis also had important implications for the development of medieval medicine and public health practices. The experience of the plague pandemic led to the development of new approaches to disease prevention and treatment, including quarantine practices and public health measures that would influence medical practice throughout the medieval period. The technological and agricultural innovations developed in response to the crisis had lasting impacts on medieval civilization. New farming techniques, food preservation methods, and survival strategies developed during the crisis years were passed down to subsequent generations and influenced medieval agricultural and technological development. The crisis also contributed to significant changes in settlement patterns and urban development. Many cities that had been major centers before 536 CE never fully recovered their former importance, while new centers of power and population emerged in regions that had been less affected by the disasters or that recovered more quickly. The demographic changes caused by the crisis had important implications for medieval social structure and cultural development. The high mortality rates and population movements created opportunities for social mobility and cultural mixing that might not have occurred under more stable conditions. This contributed to the cultural diversity and dynamism that would characterize medieval civilization. The memory of the crisis years was preserved in various forms of medieval literature, chronicles, and oral traditions. These cultural memories influenced medieval attitudes toward natural disasters, divine punishment, and the relationship between human society and the natural world. The crisis became part of the cultural heritage that shaped medieval worldviews and responses to subsequent challenges. The long-term environmental consequences of the crisis also influenced subsequent historical developments. The altered forest compositions, changed agricultural landscapes, and modified settlement patterns created by the crisis years provided the environmental context for medieval European development. The recovery of forests in areas abandoned during the crisis, for example, would later provide resources for medieval expansion and development. The crisis of 536 CE and its aftermath thus represents one of history's great turning points, a moment when the accumulated disasters fundamentally redirected the course of human civilization. The world that emerged from the crisis was profoundly different from the one that had existed before, and the changes set in motion during these years would continue to influence human history for many centuries to come. Understanding the long-term consequences of 536 CE provides important insights into how major disasters can reshape human civilization and create lasting changes that extend far beyond the immediate period of crisis. The events of 536 CE demonstrate that even very ancient disasters can have consequences that ripple through history for many generations, fundamentally altering the trajectory of human development in ways that continue to influence our world today. As we reach the end of our journey through the worst year in human history, it's worth reflecting on what the story of 536 CE tells us about the resilience and adaptability of human civilization. Despite facing what seemed like the end of the world with darkened skies, failing crops, deadly plague, and collapsing empires, humanity not only survived, but eventually rebuilt and created new forms of civilization from the ashes of the old. The people who lived through 536 CE and the devastating years that followed had no way of knowing that their suffering would eventually end, that the climate would stabilize, that new crops would grow, and that their descendants would create new societies and cultures. From their perspective, they were living through an apocalypse with no clear end in sight. Yet their persistence, creativity, and determination to survive laid the foundation for the medieval world that would follow. The story of 536 CE also reminds us of the interconnectedness of human civilization and the natural world. A volcanic eruption in one part of the globe affected communities thousands of miles away who had no knowledge of each other's existence. This interconnectedness, mediated by atmospheric and climate systems, meant that no community could completely isolate itself from global catastrophes. The same interconnectedness that made the disaster global also meant that recovery and adaptation could draw on innovations and strategies developed in different parts of the world. Modern scientific techniques have allowed us to reconstruct this ancient disaster with remarkable precision, combining evidence from tree rings, ice cores, archaeological excavations, genetic analysis, and historical documents to create a comprehensive picture of what happened and why. This scientific reconstruction demonstrates how much we can learn about the past when multiple disciplines work together to address historical questions. The research that has revealed the story of 536 CE continues to evolve as new techniques are developed and new evidence is discovered. Each new piece of the puzzle adds to our understanding of how this remarkable year unfolded and what it meant for the people who lived through it. The ongoing research also provides insights into how similar disasters might affect our modern world and how we might better prepare for future global catastrophes. The lessons of 536 CE are particularly relevant in our current era of global environmental change and interconnected risks. While we have advantages that 6th century populations lacked, scientific understanding of natural systems, global communication networks, and international aid organizations, we also have much larger populations and more complex technological systems that could be vulnerable to disruption. Understanding how past civilizations coped with global disasters can inform our preparations for future challenges. The human stories embedded within the larger narrative of 536 CE remind us that historical disasters affected real people with families, hopes, and fears just like our own. The farmers who watched their crops fail, the parents who struggled to feed their children, the leaders who tried to maintain order in the face of overwhelming challenges. These were people facing impossible circumstances with courage, creativity, and determination. The recovery from 536 CE also demonstrates the importance of community solidarity and cooperation in overcoming major challenges. The communities that survived and eventually thrived were often those that were able to maintain social cohesion, adapt their practices to new circumstances, and support their most vulnerable members during the worst times. These lessons about the importance of social cooperation remain relevant for modern societies facing global challenges. The story of 536 CE ultimately tells us something profound about the human condition, that we are capable of surviving and adapting to circumstances that seem impossible to overcome. The people who lived through the worst year in history didn't just survive. They preserved knowledge, maintained cultures, and passed on the accumulated wisdom of their civilizations to future generations. Their legacy is the foundation upon which all subsequent human achievement has been built. The year 536 CE stands as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. It shows us how quickly the familiar world can change, how interconnected our fates truly are, and how important it is to treasure the stability and prosperity that we often take for granted. But it also shows us that even in the darkest times, human creativity, cooperation, and determination can find ways to survive, adapt, and eventually rebuild. As we face our own global challenges in the 21st century, the story of 536 CE provides both a sobering reminder of how fragile civilization can be and an inspiring example of how resilient humanity can prove to be when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. The people of 536 CE could not have imagined the world their descendants would create, just as we cannot fully predict how future generations will adapt to the challenges of our time. The worst year to be alive ultimately became, through human effort and resilience, the foundation for new forms of civilization that would flourish for centuries to come. The darkness that fell in 536 CE was not permanent. The crops eventually grew again, and human communities found ways to adapt, survive, and thrive. In learning about their struggles and their ultimate success in overcoming seemingly impossible challenges, we gain insight into our own capacity to face whatever difficulties the future may hold. The remarkable year of 536 CE reminds us that while we cannot always control the natural forces that shape our world, we can control how we respond to them. The courage, ingenuity, and persistence of the people who lived through the worst year in history provide a powerful example of human resilience that continues to inspire us nearly 15 centuries later. Their story is our story, and their ultimate victory over catastrophe is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.